Welcome, Jeffrey Tucker. And yeah, so glad to have you with us today. And you have the floor. You can go right ahead.
Really? So for how long should I speak, do you think?
About 30, up to 30 minutes. It's up to you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think what I'd like to do is talk about some monetary fundamentals because I think we forget this a lot. You know, I mean, one of the frustrations I have, and I think it's the same frustration we all feel, is that history isn't moving forward enough. I remember when Bitcoin first proved itself to be a viable alternative to national money, the first one in maybe modern age and hundreds of years, and certainly the first in the digital age after many experiments. Bitcoin actually worked for a variety of technical and theoretical reasons. And at that moment, I really hoped that society would get smart and that we would rally around it and it would be widely adopted and used, and we would bail out of national money. Now, there's a number of problems here. One is the information problem. It took a long time for people to come to believe. Many years, in fact. I remember the incredible abuse I faced in early 2013 when I first read about this, at a time in which it was this grave incredulity towards the cryptocurrency, and people thought that I was rallying behind some sort of scam. Now, it's true that prior to Bitcoin, there were many attempts to create a digital currency. It didn't work. That collapsed into scams, not because they were scams, but because they got hacked, and it just wasn't working. So people thought that I had become part of a, you know, pump and dump scheme or something like that. It was actually, for me personally, somebody who very much values my reputation, I guess as any professional does. It was worrisome because I realized if I had been wrong on this, that I would have had to claw my way back. And I wasn't sure I was right. I just had a pretty good intuition about it. So I began to write about it. I turned out to be correct, I think. And it was good. It was good. It was all good. But what I had underestimated at the time was the number of problems that are associated with adoption. There's the network effects, right? So everybody's already using dollars, everybody's already using credit cards, people are invested in national money, and making that shift to something new is not something that Americans are really very good at in particular, but actually nobody is. If things work, then why do something else? But so there's a network effect problem. There's the problem that the monetary system as we know it isn't currently as broken as it was when Satoshi invented Bitcoin, where the financial system was collapsing. And even it's very interesting in the last 5 months, and we've seen governments deliberately destroy prosperity all over the world and lock everybody down and really do fundamental attacks on human rights in the most egregious form that we'll ever see in our lifetimes, I think. And certainly generations of people have never faced anything like this. And yet it's been fascinating to see the Bitcoin, that the financial system has continued to perform. For now, we don't know what that's going to look like in the future, but it's continued to perform. I do think it's fascinating that over the last 5 months, the one thing that nobody ever considered shutting down, because they can't, is the cryptocurrency world, right? So it's you know, even Trump is talking about shutting down TikTok in the United States today, you know, but it's inconceivable to shut down a distributed network because there's no single point of failure. So that's been actually a glorious aspect. By the way, I have people screaming outside my door, so I'm going to just shut it. If you'll just hold on 1 second. Hey, y'all, I'm actually on a, thank you. So, my apologies, children. By which I mean people in their 20s. Anyway, but there was the problem I never really expected, and I hadn't anticipated, even though the scaling debate had been going on really quite early, and I couldn't be bothered to look at it because I thought it was too technical for my understanding, was that not everybody in the Bitcoin community was in favor of adoption. And many people got ahead of themselves in thinking that they had invented the new digital gold, which would serve as a foundation for a monetary system that would then be layered on top of that many times over. Um, I'm not saying that that's incorrect, but they're way ahead of themselves, and money has to follow a certain evolution, natural evolution through the market. And you can discover this if you read Carl Menger. You can find out how and where money comes from, or you can just look at normal monetary history and see that um, money is an outgrowth of barter. It's a more advanced stage of economic development, but it goes through experimentation. There's entrepreneurship, money, the invention of money and the use of money and the adoption of money on a widespread basis is subject to the normal forces of entrepreneurship that everything else is, whether it's software, things in the digital economy, or really anything, medical treatments, just whatever it is, housing techniques, technology, everything is subject to a market test. And certain developers within the Bitcoin community imagined that they would game the system by artificially restricting the ability of Bitcoin to be adopted on a widespread basis. Now, I didn't understand that in 2013, 2014, 15, 16. I'm trying to think, it's hard to deconstruct these dates now. But there was a point at which I used to use Bitcoin all the time for small purchases, actually plane tickets and coffee and everything else. And I thought that the goal, as it always is, in any kind of monetary innovation, is to seek adoption and use, because you've got a big problem. You've got a network effect to overcome with the dollarization and national monetary systems, generally speaking. So you need people to be able to use it, have friendly interfaces, have producers accept it, consumers adopt it, and see ever more use. That's always the goal of any money. And to my great shock, I woke up one day and discovered that Bitcoin was actually almost unusable, actually. And I felt like my beloved cryptocurrency had been invaded by somebody who was not in favor of it ever becoming a money, and had throttled it in a way that made it far less useful and far slower and far more expensive than national money. So obviously, under those conditions, Bitcoin couldn't ever perform, and it was a shock. Very soon after that, of course. And by the way, I'm not just a cryptocurrency researcher, right? So I'm doing research on many other things, international trade issues, antitrust issues, cultural topics. I write about everything. So I went through a couple of years without having risked my career on writing about Bitcoin. I went through a few years. Well, I went through a couple of years of writing about it, took off a couple of years, and came back to it, and discovered it had to become something like Dr. Frankenstein's monster, something completely unfamiliar to me. And it was all because of the scaling problem. There's just like one flaw and one mistake, and but it ruined any hope that Bitcoin could ever have for overcoming the network effects of the globalization of the dollar as a currency. So I wasn't involved in the fork, but when it happened, and it was shocking when it happened, I didn't even at that point entirely understand why it had to happen. But after it happened, I realized that something had to give, that there had been a fatal flaw at the heart at the Bitcoin developer community that ended up really throttling the chance that Bitcoin, during a very critical period, could have ever become a viable competitor to the dollar. So Bitcoin Cash didn't have a network. It was a brand new currency. It was like starting all over again. But it had to happen because at least the developers of Bitcoin Cash understood that there can't be such a thing as a money that is not useful in exchange. Now, I know this. I've always known this because I've read the works of the Austrian economists, but I'm happy to say that many modern Austrians actually understand this too. And so the great economist George Selgin figured this out very quickly. He realized that Bitcoin couldn't ever be a money under those conditions, that you have to go through a natural stage of evolution. So he debated in the Soho Forum in New York, and unfortunately lost the debate. But it's just really sad that many people in the core community have never really thoroughly understood this very important point, that markets have to evolve on a natural way to scale up, scale up, scale up, and eventually become economically viable for the masses of people. So I happen to think that Bitcoin Cash, among probably many others, but I think Bitcoin Cash is probably the top currency in that respect, has the possibility of becoming, basically a hand-to-hand currency, which is to say, widely accepted. But then, and I'm not really part of these debates anymore, but I rallied around BCH, and then it promptly got treated to the Twitter mobs, right? And that was a terrible period. Actually, I didn't like it because I've always been a champion of privatized currencies, whatever form they take. I don't even care what you call it, as long as it's out of the hands of government. So to be accused of, yet again, of being part of a pump and dump scheme, of being a scamster, of all these things, subject to harassment, intimidation, it was horrible. And actually, at the time, people had warned me that if I showed any sympathy for the fork at all, that I would be subjected to this. But it was far worse than I really imagined, and nobody wants to live that way. It's disgusting. Now, as far as I know, these days, and I'm not maybe that active, or maybe I've just blocked all the right people, but it doesn't seem like the abuse is continuing as much as possible. Back in the day when, after the fork occurred, we kept hearing again and again about second and third tier layer solutions are going to be piled on top of BTC. And yeah, I'm all for that. That all sounds great. But it always struck me as overly rationalistic and overly pre-programmed, as if the smartest people in the world were going to gamify the invention of a new monetary base, but they never really wanted to bother with the market, which is the strangest thing, because actually the greatest thing about a cryptocurrency is that, over national monies, is that it's actually part of the market experience, unlike national monies that were basically nationalized and imposed by governments and throttled in their development. And so the great thing about cryptocurrency is that it's supposed to be adaptable and changed. As far as I know, that is the essence of the BCH developer community today. So I'm actually very optimistic. I'm very frustrated that it's taking so long to get there. But I've been frustrated since I first discovered Bitcoin. And again, my excitement about Bitcoin was not really this sort of abstract intellectual position that it would become, some base money for the world. The real test, and this is true now, and it'll always be true, the real test of a cryptocurrency is whether or not a regular person can find it useful and a regular merchant can accept it. I must tell you, it's actually been a very strange thing, because Bitcoin was supposed to be adaptable and progressive and move forward in history in a way in which the dollar couldn't. In 2013 and 2014, you could go anywhere at PorcFest in New Hampshire, or really many big cities had lots of merchants that were accepting Bitcoin. You could spend it, you could use it, you could trade it, and it was very common. In the years that's since then, it's been ever less and ever less and ever less. So adoption has actually gone down. I've been a part of debates for some years with advocates of Bitcoin Core, who actually, it's a consistent position, I guess, but they're against adoption. They don't want you to adopt the HODL movement, right? Now, then at some point, I began to get frustrated by this, and I really began to notice that the HODL movement amongst the BTCers were mostly the old gangsters, which some people would consider me among them. I don't know. I mean, 2013 doesn't sound that old, but that what they began to get upset about was competition in the crypto realm. They thought there should only be one cryptocurrency, and they thought that every new cryptocurrency would diminish the status and value of BTC, which to them hurt their holdings. Now, to me, once I discovered that this was actually the motivation, struck me as an outrageously, like an economically ignorant, backwards, and mercantilist, even protectionist outlook, and fundamentally selfish. In other words, you want to throttle the development of cryptocurrency just so that your gangster, your old gangster original token can be as valued as high as possible. That's contrary to free enterprise, it's contrary to competition, it's contrary to economic logic, and actually smacks of a kind of what you might call kind of a crypto fascism, actually. And it took me a while to realize that this is what's going on, but that's definitely struck me at some point that is at least in part of the motivation for the BTC HODL movement. And I think it's not a future for humanity. It's a future for a few, but it's not a future for the whole world. So let me just use my last minutes here to talk a little bit about why we're involved not just in a struggle for sound money, not just in a struggle for free enterprise brought to the subject of currency itself, but why I think that we're really in a struggle for human rights itself. And I think we should be aware of this now more than ever. So let's go back in time a little bit. Before the advent of central bankings and the nationalization of currency into the late 19th century, where we had global free trade, no income tax, very limited government, very little debt. Governments didn't tell, most governments in the world, maybe outside of Germany, never told anybody what wages they had to pay their employees. There were very few restrictions on migration anywhere in the world. In other words, a time before central banks, just before central banks, was a time of relative freedom. Not perfect freedom. There were plenty of problems in the world, but things were gradually improving. And we didn't have to, you could make money and keep all the money you earned. You could live and even be a citizen of most any country in the world that you wanted to go to. You could hire whom you wanted. You could start a business without facing a plethora of government regulations. In other words, government was more or less contained, too big, but at least restrained, because everything it did, it had to pay for by taxing its citizens, and governments mostly don't like to tax people because people don't like to be taxed. The invention of central banking was originally supposed to be about providing a flexible monetary policy that could adapt to the supply and demand, and then maybe restrain some of the inflationary tendencies of wildcat banking, diminish business cycles. The idea was to bring rationality to monetary policy. And as with most things that governments do, the opposite happened. So in the United States, we followed Germany and followed the Bank of England and created a central bank. What that did is put money fully in control of a banking system that had a symbiotic relationship with government, because it was the government that actually created the central banks. And the dollar became de facto nationalized, even if it was restrained somewhat by a gold standard, but the restraint didn't last that long, because very quickly after that, the US did the unthinkable thing and turned what was a regional conflict, military conflict, into a global war. That happened, and I'm citing here the research of Benjamin Anderson, who wrote about this in the mid-1920s with an empirical research about the role of central banks in the prolongation and the murderous horror we called World War I. He blamed it all on the central banks. Now, some central banks were worse than others, but I think if you're interested in counterfactual history, you could go back and say that the US probably never would have turned a regional conflict into a global war without having a printing press in the central bank that was going to consider the banking system and the government too big to fail. After all, now the limits had been taken off money. So the nationalization of currency at that time unleashed that horror on the world. It's not a coincidence and that was a catastrophe for Europe. And I don't want to go through the political history. It was a catastrophe for Europe. It was a catastrophe for the U.S. In the U.S., we faced during that war censorship, a shutdown of futures markets, a brief shutdown of the stock markets, a first test really of what a total state looks like: conscription, death, and it destabilized American society like nothing else had ever done. Not even the Civil War had been so damaging. By the time the soldiers came home, demoralized, PTSD, a disaster, they came home to a society that was very different from the one they left. The central bank not only unleashed hell abroad, it also unleashed it at home. So immediately we saw the advent of the regulatory state, minimum wages, zoning laws, the imposition of Jim Crow laws, regulation of wages, a banning of women's work in many places, the income tax, the new direct elections of senators, which destabilized the relationship between the federal government and the states. Like in the course of just a few years between 1913 and 1918 and 1920, we saw a complete transformation of a relatively laissez-faire world, a world that was getting ever freer, into a world that was where the total state was descending, suddenly involved in all aspects of our lives, food and drug regulation, the cartelization of the medical profession, all the things that are wrong with the world were born in those few years, fundamentally trace to the advent of central banks and the nationalization of currency and the removal of money out of the market to put it in the hands of the ruling class, backed by government power. That was, I would say, the original sin that happened in the early 20th century that unleashed almost all the hell we're dealing with now. Now, people have a hard time understanding this, right? You have to understand something about the history of money and the complicated relationship between central banking and the rise of statism to get the whole feel for this. But once you do, you realize that this really is, centralized money is the fuel for Leviathan and ultimately the murder, war state and despotism at home. And we saw this unfold all over the world. So the Weimar inflation ultimately destabilized and destroyed Germany and led to the rise of Hitler. It provided the means for the U.S. to get to do what it did in World War II. World War I was just a rehearsal for the catastrophe that happened 20, 30 years later. We had prohibition in this country, mostly, again, the arrogance fueled by cheap money led the American elites to imagine that they could abolish forever the consumption and distribution of alcohol. Again, I blame central banking and the nationalization of currency. After World War II, war, more depressions, more inflations, more wars, more debt, bigger and bigger government, everything. And then finally, it ended up as we would expect, the abolition of the gold standard and the advent of pure paper money controlled by the central state. Technologically backwards, yes, but very, very favorable towards Leviathan control of the world. We're coming up now to the 50th anniversary of the end of the gold standard, by the way. And we have nothing good to say about it, nothing good to say about it. So something had to give. Finally, crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis, we come to the 21st century and the disaster of the 2008 financial crisis and the invention, finally, of a private money for the digital age. As far as I'm concerned, it's the greatest invention in all of human history and offers the greatest hope for progress, peace, and freedom. And finally, the normalcy in our times that the world has ever seen. I think it's also one of the great tragedies, and historians will have to look back at this period and deconstruct what happened, because, and I can't say a perfect counterfactual, but I can tell you that the promise of Bitcoin was so high in 2013, 14, and 15 that had Bitcoin scaled, I think we might be living in a very different world today. The initial fork was a stopgap measure, and I think absolutely essential, but it also it was essential. But I think what happened to Bitcoin was one of the great calamities. We're now living in month 5 of a world lockdown, where tens of millions of jobs have been destroyed, where poverty is spreading all over the world economy among non-developed or non-first world societies, where children are going hungry, where governments have exercised unprecedented totalitarian powers, where churches have been shut, where theaters have been smashed, where arts have been destroyed, where people are being treated like animals all over the world, where we've seen unprecedented levels of psychological, cultural, economic, social devastation by these lockdowns, all in the name of controlling and mitigating a virus based on recommendations of a bunch of crazy cranks who have no idea what they're doing and will never pay the price for what they've done to our societies. And I think we have to ask the question, how did they get away with it? How did they get away with it now? And they could have never done this in the past. And I think ultimately this traces to a kind of hubristic pretensions of power and expertise that is fueled fundamentally by the central bank. And sure enough, this year we've seen the Federal Reserve used in ways that was never even intended or imagined by its founders, or even under the worst types of management of the 20th century. We've got the Fed now creating trillions in new money, actively involved in the securities industry and buying municipal bonds, doing anything possible to keep the economy afloat during times when human rights have been violated on a mass scale like none of us ever hoped to see. Why? If you want to dig deep enough and really understand why, I think you have to go back to the fact that the states have monopolized the printing press. It's the nationalization of money that's unleashed this hell on the world. So let me tie this up and say this. We live in times of great desperation, great sadness, great pessimism and horror at what's been done to the world. Where's the hope? Where's the sign of hope? Well, ultimately, the hope's got to come from within your heart, right? You have to believe. You have to believe that there's an answer, and ultimately, you have to protect yourself. You have to guard your own spirit and live as good a life as you have, regardless of the world around you. But politically, institutionally, economically speaking, I think the highest hopes we have is in a currency that's detached from the state, that the people can manage. Because if we achieve that, we drive a wall. We build a wall between the people who have done this to us, the state, its ruling class, and its managers, who care nothing about your liberty or human rights or your fate at all. Anyone, really. They just care about their own power. We put up a wall between them and the life we want to live. So I think the struggle for a usable, widely distributed, networked, widely adopted private currency that lives on the internet in a decentralized way that can never be taken down by anybody, that has no single point of failure, that is a consumer-friendly commodity. That struggle for that is the struggle for life itself, for the good life itself, for human liberty. So this is not ultimately, my friends, I think, about technology. It's not really about a fight between geeks on Twitter. It's not a fight over scaling. Yes, scaling is important, but it's not a fight over code. It's a fight over life itself. Let me conclude by saying the following. I hope you're in for the long term. I hope you're in for the long haul. Things are not going as quickly as we want. But BCH represents hope for the future. It does. Don't give up that hope. Future generations will thank you. Thank all of us for the work we're doing right now. And I will say this, we face a choice. You fight, you use this currency, you promote it, you develop it, you protect it, you guard it. Why? Because we will not live in cages. Human beings are not meant to live that way, and we won't live that way. We will not be part of somebody else's dystopian novel. We will write the story of our own lives. A well-networked, beautiful cryptocurrency that is owned by the people and not the state is possibly the most important tool that we have in the struggle for human rights around the world today. Thanks very much, and I'll conclude with that. And take any questions, maybe.
Oh my God, Jeffrey, I have read your stuff before, but that is a stunning talk that really touched me. I don't even know what to say. That's the first talk I'm gonna slice up and upload. I mean, seriously, that is so inspirational. That reminds me of the kind of fire that I felt. You know, I don't know if you're an Ayn Rand fan, but I get a lot out of reading Ayn Rand, and I get a similar feeling from what you just said.
I appreciate that very much.
Wow.
I'm a big fan of Ayn Rand. I also spent 10 wonderful years as a good friend of Murray Rothbard. I'm sure you've heard of Murray, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
There's certain people who lived and affected the world very profoundly, and their spirit lives on. And certainly in my case, my years with Murray changed me and affected me. You know, there's only one thing that really made him angry, and that was pessimism. Because he knew that pessimism was the thing that would kill the human spirit and therefore affect the future. And Murray always believed that history is built off the ideas we have in our hearts, the inspiration we feel. And I think that's something he learned from Rand too. And I believe that also.
That's such a big thing in her writing that I certainly took away from it. You know, the whole, there's a quote, you know, those who, you know, if you fight for the future, you know, you're essentially living in it. I mean, that's a terrible paraphrase of the quote. Maybe you know what I'm referring to, but I know that motivates me. I want to live in that future that you described, you know. It's so painful to think that, you know, if only we had you know, preserved you know, the Satoshi's vision as you know, under the BTC chain, that, you know, how much farther ahead could we be today, and how great is the mission that we in Bitcoin Cash have today, you know.
Well, you know, I've reflected on this all the time, and it's a little bit mysterious to me because in the early days, I thought that we had the perfect technology, and that's kind of a mistake to think that, right? I mean, like, I thought that we finally had it all figured out, and that now a protocol that wouldn't be subjected to manipulation by you know, mistaken intellectuals or greed or jealousies, or, you know, all those terrible human vices. It would somehow be not subject to that. But there was one tiny thing that went wrong, and that was the scaling question. It was deciding whether and to what extent Bitcoin could be made to be usable for ever wider and wider adoption. And, you know, I didn't understand that, you know, like when people used to talk about this in 2014, I used to think, well, that's slightly boring. you know, and that it turned out to be the single most important thing. And, you know, now here we are in 2020, we're looking back and wondering what the counterfactuals are, you know, what might have been. Amazing, isn't it? But, you know, I think it's just generally a mistake when you think that human perfection has arrived. You know, it usually hasn't. And I think we were maybe all a little bit too adoring of at least I was too adoring of the protocol back then, not realizing that it would be subjected to human fallibility in such a strange way. And you know, I hope somebody's writing the history of this debate and what happened. I probably somebody much smarter than I am is currently doing that, and I hope they do. I wrote the introduction to a book that Roger published, I guess last year on the history of Bitcoin, but it didn't really address this particular point. But somebody needs to write this book, I think, because I think it's on one hand it's a calamity, but it's also a warning, you know, but also it's a story that ends in hope, really, because fortunately, as an open source protocol, you know, we can fix the errors, and BCH, that fork did that. I remember also the sadness I felt at the fork, right? Because I don't think anybody wanted it to happen. It was just something that had to happen because you can't, yeah, because we believe in widespread adoption. You know, that's I think the fundamental point. And unfortunately, for some reason, a plurality of developers within BTC stopped believing in that, and that's a story I hope somebody can tell at some point in a major work.
Yeah, I would like to understand that as well. All right, well, Jeffrey Tucker, I really appreciate you giving us that talk today. I think we all really needed it, and I think it's gonna motivate us for some time to come.
Well, we certainly need that motivation now. You know, it's been these have been. Look, I don't know who is listening or what the story of their lives are, but I will tell you this, that I think these have been the most difficult moments of our lives. At least I'm speaking for myself, but I'm also speaking for many loved ones and people I work with, and the challenges that we face ultimately, yeah, economically, financially, physically. We can't even go where we want to be. I mean, we've been separated from families and loved ones, you know, for months now. But psychologically, I think that's been the biggest cost for us because we never imagined anything like this could ever happen to us. And we've all been fundamentally destabilized, and we're trying to figure out how to live, not just with a virus, but with a really terrifying disease called statism, right? We're trying to figure out how to live in the midst of that thing. But, you know, in this struggle that we're going through right now, we're not alone. I think they went through this in World War I. They went through it during World War II, in the Civil War, during the plagues, during the religious wars. Humankind has always dealt with tremendous, terrible stresses. I would say that the lockdowns of the last 5 months have been unprecedented destabilization in all of our lives. So God bless you if you can wake up in the morning with a happy heart, you know? Look, you know what's great about everybody listening right now? You're alive. You survived. We've gotten through this. Now it's time to find hope, stand up, claim your human rights, and fight for liberty. Fight for a better, more peaceful world. You have a mission. We all have a mission now, and we can make a difference. So anyway, thanks for having me.
100%.
Letting me vent. So thanks very much.
No, thank you, Jeffrey Tucker. We are really grateful to you. Thank you.
Okay, all the best. Take care.
Okay, you too. Bye. Wow, I don't know you guys. Maybe it's because I've been up for like more than 24 hours, but that touched my heart. And wherever my motivation springs from to be involved in all this stuff, it touched that too. So,
one thing you can always count on is Jeffrey's a powerful speaker.
For some reason, I had not realized how much of a powerful speaker he was before. I think I've read more of his stuff than anything else. I'm blown away.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're powerful words. If we needed a rallying cry to really help us focus, I mean, that was it.